Okay, so let me share my screen, right? Okay, I hope you see my screen, you hear me well. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining to our today's meetup session, and welcome to Baku Power BI, Excel, and Innovate Educators Meetup Group's 6th session in 2022. And let's go on with our agenda. So we'll have introduction part, and then I will give a little bit information about our sponsor, so-called Enterprise DNA, and then we'll have session which will be delivered by Heini Ilmarinen. The topic is Azure infrastructure for the Power BI data consumer, and then we'll have Q&A session. Baku Power BI, Excel, and Innovate Educators Meetup Group has organized roughly 21 or 22 meetup sessions in 2021 year, with the participation of wonderful speakers from different parts of all over the world. And this year, it's our 6th session with the participation of Heini Ilmarinen. Till now, we had hosted some session and some speakers like Jana Berkovic, Silvia Alves, Matt Ellington, others were our speakers. And all our sessions are sponsored by Enterprise DNA. Enterprise DNA gives 3 free accesses, full access to the participants of our sessions. So, and the winners are defined randomly. Actually, based upon the list of participants, our winners will be defined in next our session. And Baku Power BI, Excel, and Innovative Educators Meetup Group has more than 1,000 members. And as for Enterprise DNA, this is a great platform which is belonging to Sam McKay, where you can find the necessary information about Power BI and its components like Power Pivot, Power Query, also R language, Python, SharePoint, so on and so forth. And I strongly urge or offer you to use their services. And taking it an opportunity, I would like to give you information about the next summit, which is going to be organized by Enterprise DNA, and it will take place on 23rd May, and this summit will last for 5 days, from 23rd to 27th May. Okay, and let's meet today's speaker. Today's speaker's name is Heini Ilmarinen, who is from lovely Finland, and who is data platform MVP. I hope Heini will give the necessary information about herself in next minutes. But also, I would like to thank to Heini in her native language. Actually, here it's written in Finnish language, but I'm trying to tell her that thank you for accepting my invitation, and I hope today's topic will be very useful for our members, and good luck. This is what I'm written. Actually, I translated using Google Translator from English into her native language. So let's connect. Also, I would be very happy to see you in our next meetup session, where I will have Meltem Balleker from Turkey, and who will be talking about workflow automation with Power Apps, Power Automate, and Teams. And this is going to be happen on 26th May 2022. And our session is recorded and lively streaming, and you may also watch this video on Excel World's Facebook page. And also, if you would like to watch the recorded session of our previous say sessions. So you may do it just on my YouTube channel. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I hope and strongly believe that I will see you on May 26th. That's all from my side, Heini, and let me stop sharing, and stage is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the really wonderful welcome, and also for the nice words. That's a really nice touch, and Google Translate was quite spot on this time. So excellent work with that. It always isn't with Finnish. Finnish is a bit difficult for Google sometimes, but very nice. Good evening to all of you as well. I'm really happy to be joining this user group today and get to share my knowledge to you all. And let me start sharing the screen. If you at any point have questions, you can either write them in the chat. I'll have the chat kind of on the side, so I can keep an eye on it, and I'll just take them in at an appropriate moment. Or even if you just want to speak out your question, you can just raise your hand here, and you can then ask it yourself. So either way, write a message or raise your hand works. So let's get right to today's topic, which is going to be Azure infrastructure for the Power BI data consumer. And at least where I work on the data projects in my daily life, it seems to be that a lot of the movement of where those data sources are and we're going to be using from Power BI, they start to be in the cloud, in Azure, for example. And in Azure, we have this huge collection of different data services that we can use. We can use things like Azure SQL, Azure Data Lake, Azure Synapse Analytics, Cosmos DB, and even Azure Databricks, just to name a few. This is not the entire collection of the services available, but just a few. And of course, when we want to connect to these from Power BI, the question becomes, well, how do we reach these? How are we able to get connected? How are we able to connect to them in a way that we're able to use the data and create meaningful visualizations of that data that help us run our business in a smoother way? And that is the question that I will try to answer. How do we make these connections easy for us when we're trying to connect to these different Azure services? So to do that, we are going to start with looking at an overview of different Azure data services that are available and kind of figuring out what are the differences of these services. Then we're going to be looking at how you're going to set up connectivity from Power BI. And then lastly, we are going to be looking at something that I like to call invisible infrastructure. And that is what I kind of refer to when you are able to connect to your services with no problem. Because unfortunately, the occasions that you do notice issues, those are the kind of troublesome scenarios where you are not able to do your work as efficiently as you'd like. So infrastructure is best when it's invisible and you cannot smell it or hear it in any way. So I'll kind of finish off with kind of wrapping the information of this session and how you can reach that point. So I'm Heini Ilmarinen, and I work as a DevOps consultant at a company here in Finland called Polar Squad. And our company just focuses on DevOps, but I, for example, also focus on the data side of things. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer. So I also run some trainings around Azure as well. And my favorite angle to everything I do is really the architecture side and how things fit together, how we can make our services run smoothly so that they work seamlessly and just make everything easy for us. And actually, my background is in mathematics, and I am a bit of a math nerd still at heart. And so I'm always up for math discussions as well. All right, let me just make sure. I think the chat was on the wrong screen, so I'm able to keep an eye out for any questions as well. And lastly, you might have noticed that I might be doing some doodling here. I like to draw pictures a lot whenever I work with my customers or when doing my presentations as well. So let's begin by looking at the different data services in Azure and what we can do with them. So if we go into Power BI desktop and we, for example, look at the Azure data source options that we have available, there is a lot of options out there for us. So there's Azure SQL, Synapse Analytics SQL, Azure Analysis Services, PostgreSQL, blob storage, table storage, and the list goes on and on and on. They don't anymore even fit on one page. So there is a lot of data workloads that can be running on Azure for us. And so it means that we need to be quite familiar with what are the different methods that we can connect to these services. And of course, to choose the right service as well. What is the kind of workload that we are going to need for our scenarios? And I'm not sure if you're in those discussions of choosing the actual data service that you're running. And sometimes, of course, it comes as a given. You, for example, have an Azure SQL and you just need to connect to it. But of course, if you have some say in what kind of data service you are going to use, it's good to know what are the differences of these services. So for example, we have some services that are more like databases. So that, for example, includes the Azure SQL database and the Azure Synapse Analytics SQL and Azure database for PostgreSQL. But then we have other kinds of storage available as well. And that, for example, includes the Azure Blob storage and table storage. And Azure Cosmos DB, on the other hand, is a NoSQL database. So also the variety of what these data sources can do for you are quite varying. There are many options that we can go with. So, but there are kind of two general categories that we can divide the data sources that we use into. And one aspect is any data source that we might have running on a virtual machine. So pretty much we can have a virtual machine where we have any data software running and we can use that as a data source in our Power BI. And that is kind of something that isn't necessarily listed in the Azure specific data sources in the list that we just looked at. But this is kind of, it can be your custom data service that you are running that isn't Azure specific, but just a service you run on a virtual machine. But of course, the list that we looked at mainly then included these ready-made data services on Azure that are kind of packaged in a way that they are providing, a ready database for us, for example, on Azure. So if we look at the differences of these two categories, when we're talking about virtual machines, it means that, yes, we have some software running on a virtual machine, but on the other hand, it also requires us to have a virtual network. And on that virtual network, then we have this virtual machine running. And if we talk about virtual machines, it means that, yes, we need to take care of networking. How are we going to, where are we going to have these virtual machines? How are we going to connect to it, and so forth. On the other hand, it means that we need to do a lot of configuration. In Azure, there are some ready-made images available that we can create our virtual machine off of, but you might a lot of times need to do your custom configuration there to set up, for example, your SQL server, etc., what you might want to run in there. So it means that you have a lot of configuration overload that you need to do as well. And lastly, when we're running with virtual machines, we do need to take care of patching and updates as well. So if we put up a virtual machine, it's not going to get automatically updated unless you set specific settings or, for example, allow automatic updates on a Windows machine. But that's a whole different topic in itself of how to do that. But just keep in mind that you need to make sure that patching and updates are taken care of in some way. On the data services side, this is where we have all these different services come into the picture. So the SQL and Cosmos DB and Data Lake and so forth. And in general, what is common to all of these services, even though they are all different services, is that if we look at the networking side, for example, it is actually something that we do not have to handle by default. by default, most of these services have a public endpoint that we can reach them over. On the configuration side, we need to do much less configuration. There's of course always configuration options for different Azure resources, but we don't have to go in and install anything specific. And then lastly, on the patching and update side, that is something that is taken care of by the platform itself. I think we have a question. Sarah, do you want to state your question to us? It was just a not intended hands. No worries. All right, so we have this category of virtual machines and we have this category of data services. So we need to now figure out, well, what are the differences then in which we want to connect to these different types of services, and how do we go about it? So if we think about the basic workflow of working with Power BI, what it often entails is that we have some kind of data source. Here, we're not really caring about whether it's a virtual machine or an Azure service, or even an on-premise service or an Azure service for that case. But what we normally would work with is that we would use Power BI Desktop on our laptop and connect to that data service from our personal laptop. And so that means we need to have some kind of way to connect to that data service from our machine and be able to reach that data service in some way. Once we have created our report on Power BI Desktop, we're probably going to go ahead and then publish that to the Power BI service. Because of course, we want to share that report and make it available to other users as well. But at that point, when we publish the report to the Power BI service, what happens, it is now the Power BI service that will be communicating with this data source now, not our personal laptop, as when working with the Power BI Desktop. So now it means that we need to have this connectivity available in some way. And as I mentioned that, well, from the Power BI service, if there is a public endpoint to that data service, it doesn't matter where it's running, but if there's a public endpoint, the service will be able to reach it. But of course, in most cases, we probably don't want to have a completely public endpoint. If we, for example, have the service running in our own environment, we might, for example, then need to install a gateway that is then connecting and communicating with the Power BI service itself. And we have other ways as well. We'll get to that in a little bit more detail in just a little bit. But this is kind of the basic workflow that we're going to be going through and kind of figuring out how these two arrows, both from our laptop to the data service, as well as from the Power BI service to the data service. Those are the essential points to figure out how does that connectivity work. So if we now look at these two different categories of data services that we might be running in Azure. So first, the virtual machines. We need to remember that for these, we have normally a virtual network. And what a virtual network is, it's really your private network within Azure. And by default, we don't have a public endpoint available in that virtual network. And for a data service, we probably don't want to make a fully public endpoint even available. We don't want to make it accessible from anywhere in the world. So when we first start to work with Power BI Desktop, we have to figure out like, well, how are we going to connect to this virtual machine? And because it is a private network in Azure, that it's then connected to, we need to have some kind of connectivity to that virtual network. And one example how we could do that is, for example, by having a VPN, or there could be an express route from an office site to Azure as well. But it means that there needs to be some kind of connectivity between your laptop and that data service. And when the time comes and we are ready to take this report and publish it to Power BI service, again, you know the drill already. we need some kind of connectivity to this virtual machine. And this is where the on-premise data gateway comes in. What you would do with this is that you could install this in that same virtual network where you have the actual data service running and install it on another virtual machine. But now you remember we talked about virtual machines. So it means that you need to configure that on-premise gateway. You have to install it on that virtual machine. Plus you need to make sure that you are taking care of the management and updates of that virtual machine as well. So we notice that we already have this virtual machine where we're running our data service, and that we already need to manage. But on top of that, now we have this on-premise data gateway that we also need to keep up to date as well. So we get a little more overhead all the time in this case. But this does, what the on-premise data gateway does is it allows us to connect to that data service from Power BI, from the Power BI cloud service as well. So that is how we're able to configure this connectivity to even private networks. And even though I've been talking about this from the perspective of Azure, this is what you could do in your on-premise environment as well. If you have a private network where your data service is running in, you would bring in your own on-premise data gateway that you install on a virtual machine, and then you would use that gateway to be able to connect to your data service. If we, on the other hand, look at the different data services, so these that are more packaged and more managed services that we don't have to configure so much. So let's take the example of Azure SQL in this case. If we're going to connect to this Azure SQL, let me take this question that just popped in the chat. So the question is the on-premise gateway the same as an enterprise gateway versus the personal gateway? So actually, the on-premise data gateway comes in two flavors. One is the enterprise and one is the personal gateway. So those would be both called on-premise data gateways, just two different tiers. And those two gateway types have little differences in the capabilities, and you can find the up-to-date list on the Power BI data on-premise data gateway documentation site. I can probably grab that to the chat in a little bit as well. So same thing. Excellent. All right. Nice. We got the link in the chat already. Thanks, everyone. All right. So when we talk about these data services, as we already talked about, by default, they have a public endpoint. And it might sound a little curious, like why would they have a public endpoint? But we need to remember that this kind of comes from the history of Azure. Back in the day, the situation was actually that when we had some kind of these PaaS services, these more packaged services that we used, for example, Azure SQL, the only endpoint that you would have is a public endpoint. You didn't have other options available. And that is kind of from where these services have evolved. So now when you do create a service, it asks you how you want to configure the networking. It doesn't just pop the public endpoint for you out of the box kind of without asking. It's an option there, but it still defaults to the public endpoint at this point. So when you're setting up an Azure SQL, if you go with the default settings, you end up with a public endpoint, but you do have something called firewall settings. And these allow you to control who can access that service and who cannot. And when you are then connecting here from your Power BI desktop, well, you're going to get blocked by those firewall settings unless you do something about it. And what you can do in these firewall settings is that you can create IP rules and allow, for example, your personal IP address, whether it's from your home or from the office, and put that in the allowed IP list in those firewall settings. And that makes it possible for you to connect to that Azure SQL database that you have created. Then when you are ready to publish it to the cloud, well, we again have this issue. We have this firewall in place. And what do we do in this case? Well, in these firewall settings, what we have available is this setting called Allow Azure Services. And it's a little tricky with this setting, because what this setting means is that you are allowing all Azure services, not just your Power BI, not just your Azure services, but allowing all Azure services. And if you think about how many people and organizations are running their services in Azure, it sounds a little iffy to open it that much. But with that Allow Azure Services setting, you are able to have it also available to your Power BI service. And it is able to reach that data set as well. So that does definitely solve our problem. But it might still not be an ideal situation. But there is actually a new feature available that brings some ease to this situation, a better solution. So with the Azure Data Services, we are actually able to configure them within a virtual network as well. And to do that, we need to configure something called either private endpoints or service endpoints. And there are differences in how these two methods work, but shortly, the private endpoint creates a private IP address for your data service in your virtual network and within a specific subnet. And then just that IP address is connected to your specific instance of Azure SQL, for example, so to a specific resource. The service endpoints, on the other hand, they create a trust relationship between your subnet and the Azure SQL resource in general. So you're not exactly kind of creating a one-on-one connection, but you're creating kind of this trust relationship. And then you're allowing traffic from only from a specific subnet to go to your Azure SQL. So those are the two options in which way you can set your data service within a virtual network in Azure. But how does this help us? Because now we realize, well, we're kind of in a similar situation that we were with the virtual machines. We have this service in our virtual network. So how do we now reach it from the cloud? And we could still go with the same option as we went with virtual machines. We could have an on-premise data gateway in here as well and use that. But there is a slightly better option available as well. And that is actually something called a virtual network data gateway or VNet data gateway. And what that is, it is a managed kind of component that is managed by Power BI service itself. And it gets linked to a specific subnet in your virtual network. And then through that virtual network data gateway, you are able to reach your data service that is in your Azure virtual network. This is nice, and it's like, ooh, super cool. But there's a little but here, because this is only available in premium, and it is currently still in preview. So it is in premium, but remember you have, of course, premium capacity, or you also have premium per user that you can use to have this capability. And this being in preview, of course, means that it is still developing and there are still changes coming in, and it's going to get better over time. So just remember those things. All right. Excellent. So we're actually going to take a look at how this whole virtual network data gateway setup works, and a bit at Azure resources as well. And I have done a little prep beforehand just because we have a bit of limited time. So here is an Azure SQL database that I have created. And this is actually based on the sample data set that you can choose when you create an Azure SQL database. And this has been all set up here in the Azure portal. And we talked about the server firewall rules, the firewall settings, and these are these ones that you can then adjust. And for example, I have my IP address added here. And then there is this setting of allow Azure services and resources to access this server. So this would be how we allow Power BI to connect to this Azure SQL if we do not want to have like a virtual network setup and so forth. We would just check this to yes and move on with it after that. So that would be our way forward. But we want to look at some, maybe a more complicated setup that we can do. So first of all, we are going to need a virtual network as we talked about. So I don't have that in place yet. I'm going to show you how to do it. So in the Azure portal, we can just, there's a few ways in which we can navigate to create a new resource. We can find the networking here. And then we want to create a virtual network here. And what we need to do when we want to create that, we would have to choose the subscription that we're using, choose the resource group, and then give it a name. So let's do that. And I'll just keep it in Switzerland North. Because normally I use West Europe, but there's been with sponsored subscriptions, there's been a little issues now and then in getting certain resources. So I'll just play it safe. And then it actually, the Azure portal suggests some settings for you for the IP addresses. You want to have enough IP addresses available, but also like you don't have to overkill it. If you're just testing things out, 65,500 addresses might be a little too much, but it doesn't really matter if you still keep the entire set there. And what you can think about the virtual network address space, it's just an address space reservation. It is actually the subnets that you create that then determine what addresses are available to each service. So I'm just gonna remove the default one and create a separate one for this. And just give it an address range. The nice thing about the portal is it kind of gives you the feedback of is your address space correct, how many addresses are available there, and any other details that you might need. All right, so we're just going to add that subnet in there. There is a few other settings that you can put on, but for our use case, we don't actually need those specific settings. And then we can just click review and create. And it'll just do some verification in the end to confirm that the settings are right. And let's hope that it is smooth for us today. There we go. And then we can just create that virtual network. So this is what we need to do on the Azure side. So what we need to have in place in Azure is, of course, we need our data service, but we also need a virtual network available as well. And to be able to create those, we do need to have an Azure subscription. And the Azure subscription is pretty much just like, how is your services built? And if you haven't been testing with Azure services, remember that there is a free trial available for you, and you can always go and get one and test the services out. All right, so our service is created. This is the virtual network, and we have that subnet in there that we put in place as well. You can see it from the subnets option on the left. All right. We do have the virtual network and we have the Azure SQL as well, but those two aren't actually yet connected. They are two different, they're not linked to each other in any way. So I'm just gonna navigate to the resource group that we had here. And let's just grab the Azure SQL database that we created. And we can actually create some network settings for this. But what I wanted to point out from the database is that for Azure SQL, we have actually this Azure SQL server, and we have an Azure SQL database, which is created within that server. So within the database itself, that is not where we're doing the networking settings, but instead we want to go to this server level instead. And this is where we have these network settings available that we might want to set. So we have firewalls and virtual networks. So this is the firewall settings that we were talking about. And it gives you a few different options that you can set. But then we also have this private endpoint connections, which I'm going to use here. So this is one of the options in which we can link this Azure SQL database to our virtual network. And I'm just going to use this same naming pattern that I've been using before. We want to have it in the same region. And let's hope it has the resource selected. This is a bug. Let's give it a moment. There we go. I was a little concerned there. But yeah, we need to specify the subscription where we want to connect, the resource type that we want to connect to, and the specific resource. So remember, the private endpoints creates a private IP address and a network interface card for this particular resource. So you need to target the correct resource that you want to link with. And then within this virtual network option, we're going to tell where does this private endpoint get set. And so we choose our virtual network and we choose our subnet. Always be sure that it actually chooses the network that you've created before and not a kind of a default network it creates on the fly. And something else that needs to happen is, because with Azure, the default is to have these public endpoints. So we need to get around that name resolution that normally from the public internet you get the public endpoint of the resource. But now we no longer want that to happen. So that is what this private DNS integration takes into consideration. There's quite a bit of more details that go into this, but let's just leave it at that. It just does some magic with the name resolution to help you get the traffic actually to that private endpoint that we have in the virtual network here. So that's it. That will create the private endpoint in our subnet that we created before. So we'll let it roll for a while here. So while we let that get ready, we can kind of move on to creating the actual virtual network data gateway. And I'll show you something while we wait for that. So with this subscription that I have in place, there's something that you need to do with it. So there are these resource providers that are associated to each subscription that you have, and they might be enabled or unenabled in the beginning or registered. And what you need to do is you need to ensure that you have this Microsoft.Power Platform resource provider registered for your subscription. Otherwise, you won't be able to link this VNet gateway to your subscription. But actually, when you try to go in and create a VNet data gateway, it gives you that error if it's not in place. So it's easy to target, but it's good to know that beforehand that you do need to do that in that way. So where you do create this virtual data gateway is in the Power Platform Admin Center. So it's good to note that this can actually be used for also Power Automate, so not just Power BI in itself, but these can be used for other uses as well. The same as with on-premise data gateways too. So when you come to the Power Platform Admin Center, there's this data option, and in here you can find this option to create a virtual network data gateway. And here we can find our subscription and our resource group that I created, and then our virtual network. And now I realized there's one more thing that we need to do on the virtual network side. So the virtual network data gateway, it actually requires that on the subnet that we have, this needs to have a delegation in place. So it needs to be able to, this Power Platform service will need to be able to kind of put resources into the subnet that we created. And if it doesn't have this delegation in place, it's not able to do it. So there are some services that require this. With some of these, it does it automatically when you choose the service and you choose the subnet. But for this data gateway, you actually need to come into the subnet that we created. And within here, we find a section called subnet delegation. And then if we search Power Platform, we need to choose this VNet access links. And that allows that connection between the VNet data gateway that is managed and then this actual subnet. And I got an error. Let's see what happened. Oh, yes, I made a mistake. Well, it isn't that bad. So when you create the Power BI data gateway or the virtual network data gateway, in that subnet, you cannot have any other resources. So when I created the private endpoint, I put it in this one. So it might have been better to name that a little differently, but let's create another subnet here. And let's name this the Power BI Gateway subnet. We can just take the next block of addresses from there and put the Power Platform VNet access links in there. So this is where it gets a little technical about the networking structure. We need to have at least 2 subnets, one for the gateway and one for the services that we want to put there. And then we're able to get going with that. So that was the error. And it's a good thing always to read the error and not just assume about what's going on. They most of the time point us in the right direction quite nicely. So also the subnet got added nicely. And if we just double check, we can see the delegation there. So if we go back to the Power Platform Admin Center, if I remember correctly, this doesn't know how to refresh automatically. So let's just grab the correct settings in here as well. Choose our virtual network. And now we can see this subnet available that we chose for us. So it gives it kind of a default name for this virtual network data gateway. And you can adjust this if you want to. I think we can just keep it at that. And there's actually this new setting that has become available a little time ago, and it is kind of this ability to auto pause this. So you can go from 30 minutes to multiple hours. So I'll just in case, so that we don't have to wait at some point, I'll just put it up to 2 hours to make sure we don't have to do any waiting on the go. So that was saved, but let's wait a moment. There we go. Now it's creating it. And so this will take a little bit of a moment before it is done creating it. We can at this point take a look at then how we can connect to the SQL service, of course, from our Power BI desktop, and how to do it then after we have the VNet gateway. Then we can see how we can publish it to the Power BI service online as well. And at this point, I think you've gotten a nice grasp of the workflow and how we need to ensure that the connectivity is available, whether we're working from our laptop or from the cloud. So let's hop into Power BI. Let's see, I had a bit of trouble getting this to zoom nicely. I hope you can see. Please give a shout in the chat if it's too small. Let's just start with get data. There's this more option where we can then see all the options that are available for Azure specifically. Let's give it a moment. Oh, my laptop is having a hard time. There's too many things happening clearly for my laptop. Yes, I'll try zooming in a bit. So we get these options. We took a look at these earlier as well. So if we click on the Azure options, we see that there's quite a list available here. And I'll zoom in a moment. It doesn't allow me to zoom while I have this particular one open here. So I'm going to choose Azure SQL database. And then there we go. I'm sorry, my laptop is having a little bit of a thinking time here. So we want to get the SQL Server database information that we want to connect to. So actually now we want to go to our Azure SQL, and we want to get the information for that. So we can either navigate to the database or the server. We will find the same connection information in both places. So we want the server name specifically for this particular use case. And so in this spot here, we have two options. We can do with import or direct query. Remember that with direct query, it will be every time you click on anything on the report, anytime you refresh anything, or kind of it has to run a new query, it will directly run it against the database and not load any data into Power BI itself. I'll use the import mode here in this case. If you needed to put any advanced options in here, you can do that as well. I'm just gonna go with the default settings here. And then of course, next is it's going to test, is it able to reach this endpoint that I put in here? Since I had already put in my, my firewall settings for my client IP, it should be fine. And soon I should be getting an option to choose some settings. And somehow, because I was testing this a bit beforehand to ensure everything works, it doesn't want to ask for my credentials before. There's a way to forget them in Power BI, but in real life, it would ask you for the login information as well. So what's your admin account and what's your password? And preferably you would have some kind of report user that you are going to use for this particular use case. So I can then see my database that I created, and then we can also see the different tables that are available here. If you test it with the sample databases that Microsoft has, you might have seen something similar to this beforehand as well. So let's just grab this first view here. So let's load that. Since today the focus is on the connectivity and getting that done the right way, we're not going to be so picky about how our report is going to look. We're just going to be doing something simple. So this is getting the model loaded here. And let's wait a moment. I feel like this is my laptop is just kind of crunching away and trying to keep up with everything happening. All right, it's waiting. it's getting the rows. And we'll get there in just a second. So now we have our table available here. This was quite simple. There is just three things available here. So let's, for example, make a clustered column chart, and we could have the parent product name here, and then the count as our y-axis. Ah, that was the wrong type. I think we should be fine with that. There we go. That one should work. So this is just a simple visual where we want to see kind of how many categories are there per parent category and get those sum totals for us. Simple, but that is totally sufficient for our use case here. And then, of course, when we get to the point that we want to publish this, I want to save my changes before that. Let's keep it simple. And then it is going to ask me which workspace I, for example, want to publish this. I'll just publish it in my workspace and let this report go to the Power BI service. Success. Excellent. All right. Well, now we start to get to the interesting part here. Of course, there's some setup behind the scenes that we need to get everything in the right order and have the virtual network and the SQL database and have those linked in the right way. As we saw already before, this has created the data gateway. And now if I come to Power BI, let's just refresh that. And just make that a little bit bigger. We can see that we have the report, and then we also have the data set available here. So, and we can then see all of the information that we might need about this particular data set. We have the gateway created. So I do want to show you that once it has been created, you can then see the gateway cluster here on the regular gateway view that you have in Power BI as well. So same place as you would see your on-premise data gateways as well. So super useful. And it is slightly thinking about what to do here and checking the gateway status. Let's hope it will find it very, very soon. So the thing is with this, that since it is a little bit of still a service in preview, I've had a little bit of inconsistencies occasionally of how quickly it is available. And that is kind of what you always have to play with when you are working with preview services. You need to kind of sometimes, there might be some things that take a little bit of time, but all in all, it has been working for me quite well. Sometimes there is this little extra waiting happening, but other than that, like the connectivity to data services, etc., has been quite good actually. So there hasn't been like issues with actually using the gateway itself. So, all right, let's do this. Let's get back to the presentation. What we would have to do still here in the Power BI workspace is that we would need to link the data set to this gateway cluster. And after we have done that, it will use this to connect connect then to our SQL that we have on Azure. So that is the one thing that we would then need to do after this. But until it's able to find the status of the gateway, we are not able to do that. So while we wait for this, let's hop back to the presentation and get to the end. And if it takes a little longer time, we can even wait until the, oh, perfect. You are good to go. So we then need to add data sources to use this gateway. And we want to, you can see here in these that it is not supported for all the services that are available in Azure, for example. So there is a limited list of services available. It's quite good. I think these are the most commonly used ones, but it is not everything that is available. And actually, we have a little bit of a simpler way to get to this, so that we kind of pull the settings from the data source that we have in place already, that we published with our report. So let's actually check it through that side and see how we can go about it. So that will be kind of an easier, more straightforward way to go about it. So we want to go to our data set, and then we want to go to our settings here. And here you can see that it doesn't, actually, it's not able to connect quite yet. And here we have this gateway connection option. So we can turn that on. And let's see, I think my workspace, I was checking this before. Sorry about that. So I should have in the workspace where I want to have this, I should have a Power BI premium license on, and otherwise it doesn't quite work. And now that I'm trying to scramble this, now I'm forgetting what is the correct place to do that. And check it. I'm a little. It should realize that I have the. It also says that it's not configured correctly. Administrators. No, I do not want to remove it. All right, I'm the administrator and I should be good to go. All right, let me give myself, oh yes, I'd be surprised if you can allocate premium capacity to my workspace. Yeah, I've had this before and I've had it in my workspace. Normally it's kind of, if you're the user who has the premium per user capacity, you're able to do it, but let's go ahead with that. Let's just, so it is a premium by default. Let's use the premium per user, and that should at least do the trick. And let's do another publish, and let's try it out. Thank you for the hint there. It's when something goes unexpected, it gets a little scrambly in the head at that point. All right, we are published. Luckily, the publish process is so fast that we are good to go in quite a fast manner. So let's just refresh that. Oops, I double clicked. And now we should at least have a workspace that has premium available. So that is kind of a very necessary thing to distinguish and ensure that you do have that available. Otherwise, things are not going to work as expected. So then if we go to our data set and the settings, and we look at the gateway connections, it says that it is not configured correctly. And what it is actually referring to is that because there is this data set that we have here, we actually want to add this to our virtual network. So by going this way, instead of through the gateway cluster and then new data source, it pulls the server and database information here for you. So it is a little more straightforward for you, but you do need to still type in the password for this and any advanced settings that you might want in this case. So then we are able to add that. This means then that this is correctly done. And we can choose that. All right. And now you can also see that the data source credentials are up to date as well. So you have kind of two ways you can go about it. Like you normally have the data set in Power BI, but when you're using the VNet data gateway, you also need to link that data source to a data set underneath that VNet data gateway. So you have to have that connection in place so that it knows what to use. So then if we come back to our workspace, we would of course then be able to view this report here as well. And it looks beautiful, very complex in this case, but all works as expected. So you have definitely now learned kind of what to ensure when you are working with these VNet data gateways. You do need to have the licensing in place. And also then if you're using premium per user, if you're using any of those premium capabilities, anyone also viewing the reports has to have that premium per user as well. So that is quite interesting and good to keep in mind. So that finally brings us to our last portion of this presentation, which is the invisible infrastructure. And as you can see, even now we had just a few hiccups on the way, and that is not how we want our infrastructure to work. We actually want it to be as invisible as possible. So how you do that is first you need to know the big picture. What is the data source that you're trying to access? Where are you working from? Are you working from home, from the office? And how do you make that connection from your own laptop to that data source? And then, of course, when you have the choice, make sure that you choose the services smartly. And I don't only mean the data source that you're using, but also how are you configuring that connectivity? Always try to find the simplest way possible to enable that connectivity, both from your laptop as well as from the Power BI service itself. And lastly, if you do run into any issues, always check networking and always check that you have access to the data with the credentials that you have available. And those are kind of the steps in which you can then ensure that you run into as little issues as possible, both when you're working from your laptop as well as after you have published this in the Power BI service. So in this session, we've run through the different Azure services that are available, a little bit of what they do and the different types that are available. We looked at what are the connectivity workflows that when you work with Power BI. And then lastly, very briefly, we looked through this concept of invisible infrastructure and how it actually should be. So thank you, everyone. Feel free to connect to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And at this end point, we are able to also go through some questions together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Heini. Thank you for your wonderful session. I appreciate your effort and your contribution on behalf of the members of Baku Power BI, Excel, and Innovate with Azure Meetup group. And we have some questions. If you don't mind, I would like to direct this question to you.
Yeah,
so,
great.
Let me begin with Pedro Medina. And he was asking, is the on-premise gateway the same as an enterprise gateway versus the personal gateway? Is that clear? Or
yeah.
You want? Okay.
Yeah. So on the on-premise data gateway, you have these two tiers. So the personal or the enterprise. They have a little different capabilities and are fitting to different kinds of scenarios. But yeah, they are kind of both on-premise data gateways and give you that connectivity to private networks, both of them.
Okay, and there are a lot of comments. I will read some of them. Fernando Calero says that, Heini, your presentation skills are spot on. And one more question from Gina Meronik. She asks that if I'm following correctly, the VNet data gateway is like a cloud-hosted version of the on-prem data gateway service. Less software, yes.
Exactly. Yeah, so behind the scenes, it is actually, there is kind of this Power BI hosted virtual network where they are running containers. And then when you create one of these VNet gateways, it runs a container for you that then is with that virtual network or the subnet delegation, it is then allowed to communicate with the subnet that we specified. So behind the scenes, it's kind of all managed for you, but it is I cannot say if it's exactly the same as on-premise data gateway, but it's similar to that as well.
And then Pedro Medina is asking the following question. Hi, Heini. Thank you for the great presentation. We are trying to migrate from on-prem SQL Server to Azure SQL database. Can you recommend other resources that walk you through the process?
Yes, there is also a good Azure data migration tool that allows you to actually run the tool against your SQL server, and it will run through your, if you have any stored procedures, etc., and just check that there is no incompatibilities with Azure SQL. And actually that tool could then be used to do the migration itself. And I believe on the documentation side, there is quite good documentation of the process itself as well. And I can definitely grab the link for that for you as well to share.
Okay, actually, I have myself also prepared some questions, but I'm not going to ask all this question. Maybe I will ask two of them. So my level one, how Power BI and Azure Analytics can increase your business impact? That's briefly, how would you answer to this question?
Well, I think with using any of the Azure data services, the benefit there is that we can get started so quickly. So it doesn't really matter which data service is in use, whether it's Azure SQL or Azure Analysis Services, or even going with something newer like Synapse Analytics. The thing is that we can get started so fast and get building, pipelines that we might need and the databases that we need. It's super fast to get started. And then, of course, the flexibility of Power BI just makes the model building very easy. and of course, from the Microsoft side, there is this idea of having that anyone can be a data consumer. I don't think that quite is the reality in all places, of course, but it makes the first step of getting into exploring your data and making visualizations so much easier. And of course, the entire point of making our data visible is bringing light to some data that is important to our business that we need to be able to see to make better decisions, for example. So really it is about just making that process of decision making based on data much more fast and more flexible as well.
Thank you for your answer. Last but not least, I would like to ask the following question. So I kindly ask you to talk a little bit about the difference between Power BI Embedded and Power BI Premium. So that will be the last question. Yeah.
Yes. The Power BI Embedded side, it is a little tricky. If you look into the documentation, you can find it talking about Power BI Embedded and embedding with Power BI. And like they're almost the same terminology, at least to my ear. But so actually you can do embedding with premium capacity or certain levels of them that allow embedding. And then there is also this Power BI Embedded that is actually an Azure service. So those are kind of different ways. The premium capacities are when you are purchasing some premium capacity for your organization. And it also has other capabilities than embedding as well. So it's not limited to that. And then you can assign that capacity to different workspaces. Similarly, as I also assigned that premium per user capacity as we were creating the new space in the very end. You are then able to assign that premium capacity to what workspaces in your Power BI service need that premium capacity. So you should always be thinking about which ones of these need it. Whereas embedded, Power BI Embedded is actually a service in Azure. So if we go to the Azure portal, we can find Power BI Embedded, and then you can link that with your Power BI tenant. And then you are able to use this capacity to embed your reports, for example, in your custom application without you having to purchase all the premium capabilities that come with the premium capacity that you can purchase through Power BI side. So it's a little different. More remember that the Power BI Embedded is just for embedding. The good thing about it is that there is this capability that, well, you pay it for when you use it. So if you just want to test it out, you put up the Power BI Embedded capacity in Azure, you set everything up, you run your tests, and when you're done, then you're done. You can just get rid of it. Whereas with Power BI Premium capacity, I have to say I'm not a licensing expert on this side, but I believe you're always committing to it for a little bit of a longer time. So for example, a year or something like that from your organization side. But the Power BI Premium per user does bring some flexibility to that as well, to the premium capacity management. I think you're muted, Ilgar.
Yes, you are right. Thank you once again. There is a noise, background. No, my kid is playing, so I prefer muting. Yeah. Once again, I would like to thank you. With your permission, I would like to stop recording.